Karen thought turning my retirement dream into her personal racetrack was just a harmless little suburban power move. But she was about to learn exactly what happens when you spend 3 decades as a high-voltage industrial electrician and decide you've finally had enough of people's garbage. You see, after 30 years of pulling wire through frozen mud, crawling through commercial subbasements, and calculating the kind of structural loads that keep skyscrapers standing, I just wanted a quiet corner of the world where my wife, Elena, could watch the sunrise without a care. Elena's been fighting early-onset Parkinson and Oppos, as for a few years now, and her world has been getting smaller, so I poured my entire soul, and about $4,000 of my retirement savings, into creating a sanctuary on our corner lot in Oak Ridge Estates. I'm talking premium Kentucky bluegrass, a custom underground irrigation system I wired myself with precision timers, and a garden that looked like it belonged on a postcard. But all that peace was shattered the moment Cynthia Vance decided my lawn was a 45-degree shortcut for her white BMW X5. It started about a week after we moved in, just a couple of tire tracks clipping the corner, a little muddy reminder that someone was too impatient to drive the extra 30 feet around the bend. I figured, okay, maybe a delivery driver got turned around, maybe a guest was distracted, but by the third morning, those tracks had turned into deep, ugly trenches shredding my turf and snapping 3 of my high-efficiency sprinkler heads like they were toothpicks. I was standing there with my morning coffee, smelling the torn earth and the faint, lingering scent of diesel exhaust, when I heard the roar of a German engine and saw her, the neighborhood queen herself, flying around the corner, gunning it straight across my property, and speeding off toward the country club without even a glance in her rearview mirror. Cynthia Vance was the kind of woman who wore tennis whites like a military uniform and looked at the rest of the world like we were just NPCs in her personal video game. Her husband, Sterling, was a high-end developer who'd built most of the luxury homes in the county, and Cynthia used that influence like a club, sitting on the HOA board and treating the neighborhood bylaws like her personal list of suggestions for the, little people, When I finally caught her at her mailbox a few days later, trying to be the civilized neighbor my mother raised me to be, I tipped my cap and said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Vance, I'm Elias, your new neighbor on the corner, and I think you might be accidentally clipping my lawn on your way out in the mornings." She didn't even look at me. She just kept flipping through her Neiman Marcus catalog and said, "It's a transitional zone, Elias. And frankly, if you're going to plant things so close to the public right-of-way, you should expect a little wear and tear. Perhaps you'd be happier in a condo, where you don and oppos. You have to worry about the big boy world." I felt that old industrial spark flare up in my chest, that cold, calculated precision that tells you exactly where the short circuit is, and I just nodded, watching her walk away in her $100 yoga pants. I went home and checked the original county plot maps. The one Sterling Vance probably thought he'd buried under layers of bureaucracy, and what I found made my hands steady and my heart go quiet. According to the master deed from 1988, my property line didn't in oppos. End at the curb. It extended another 15 feet toward the center of that, transitional zone, Cynthia loved so much, meaning she wasn't in oppos. Just clipping a corner. She was trespassing on nearly 20 feet of my deeded land every single morning. But I didn't in oppos. Call the cops yet, because in Oak Ridge, the cops played golf with Sterling, so I decided to play the game by her rules first. I installed a series of low-voltage landscape lights along the perimeter, beautiful architectural pieces that I'd wired to a motion sensor I'd tuned a trigger for anything larger than 50 pounds. The first morning she hit that sensor, 12,000 lumens of pure, blinding white LED light hit her windshield like a miniature sun, and the sound of her screeching brakes was the most beautiful music I'd heard in years. She sat there for a full minute, probably seeing spots, before she leaned on her horn for 30 seconds, and then, I kid you not, she gunned it anyway, tearing through the grass and knocking over 3 of my new fixtures. That night, my security cameras caught her coming back on foot, dressed in a black tracksuit like some suburban ninja, systematically kicking my lights into the dirt and spitting on my, private property, sign. She looked right into the lens of my hidden infrared camera, gave it the middle finger, and whispered, "Move out, old man," before disappearing back into the shadows. The next day, I had an official HOA violation in my mailbox for, excessive and non-conforming lighting, signed by the board treasurer, Cynthia Vance. The fine was $500 a day until removed. I knew then that I wasn't into oppos. Fighting a neighbor. I was fighting a system of entitlement that had been rotting this neighborhood for a decade. I called up my old buddy Silas, a guy who'd spent 40 years pouring commercial foundations for cell towers and highway overpasses, and I told him I needed a, landscaping feature, that could survive a direct hit from freight train. Silas just laughed and said, Elias, you always were a stickler for solid ground. I'll be there with the mixer on Wednesday, We spent that week doing the real work, the kind of work Cynthia and Sterling didn't into oppos. Understand, because they only ever saw the finished, pretty surface. I dug a hole 5 feet deep, well below the frost line, and I dropped in 4 sticks of heavy-duty rebar, cross-braced, and welded into a cage that would make a structural engineer weep with joy. We poured 3,000 pounds of high-strength industrial concrete into that hole, and then we set the feature, a beautiful 3-foot-tall decorative granite pillar, capped with a polished bronze plaque that read in memory of Oak Ridge Justice. To anyone passing by, it looked like a tasteful, albeit very sturdy, piece of garden art, but beneath the surface, it was an immovable anchor, an 80-inch steel and concrete iceberg waiting for its Titanic. I sat on my porch that Monday morning, Elena's hand in mine, feeling her tremble a little less as the sun started to hit the trees. I had my coffee, my camera was rolling, and at exactly 7:46 a.m., the roar of that BMW echoed through the quiet street. Cynthia was running late, probably for a board meeting where she planned to vote for my eviction, and she took that corner with the kind of aggressive confidence that only comes from never being told, no, in your entire life. The sound was incredible, a sharp, metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot, followed by the agonizing scream of high-end German engineering being shredded by simple American physics. Her front passenger will hit the pillar at 25 miles per hour, and because that pillar wasn't an oppos, going anywhere, the car had to go somewhere else. The entire front axle snapped like a dry twig, the bumper was ripped clean off, and the X5 lurched into the air before slamming back down, fluids leaking out across the pavement like the lifeblood of her ego. Cynthia stumbled out of the car, her hair a mess, her phone already in her hand, screaming so loud I could hear her through my double-pane windows. When I walked down to the curb, I didn't say a word. I just stood there with my survey maps and the permit for permanent landscape installation, that I'd filed with the county clerk, the one office Sterling didn't into oppos, have in his pocket. She lunged at me, calling me blue-collar piece of filth, and promising that her husband would have my house bulldozed by noon. But here's the thing about people like Cynthia. They think they're the only ones with a paper trail. While she was screaming, I called the state police, not the local guys, and I also called a contact I'd made at the EPA. During my research, I found out that Sterling's amended surveys hadn't an oppos. Just stolen my land. He'd been encroaching on protected wetlands behind the neighborhood to build his McMansions, and he'd been using the HOA to cover up the illegal runoff. When the state troopers arrived and saw the car totaled on my private property, and when the county surveyor I'd hired out of pocket confirmed the pillar was a full 12 inches inside my legal boundary, the look on Cynthia's face was worth every cent of my retirement. But the real kicker came when the EPA investigators started poking around the Vance property and found 3 years of illegal waste dumping and fraudulent environmental reports. By the time the dust settled, the Vances weren't and oppos. Just losing a car. They were losing everything. Sterling was hit with federal racketeering and environmental fraud charges, and Cynthia was removed from the HOA board in a landslide vote after I shared the footage of her in Ninja mission to the neighborhood Facebook group. People I'd never met started coming by with pies and beer, telling me stories of how the Vances had bullied them for years, and how they finally felt like they could breathe again. Now, every morning I sit out there with Elena, and we watch the new neighbors walk their dogs. The BMW is gone, replaced by a quiet street and the sound of the wind in the trees. The granite pillar is still there, decorated with some of Elena's favorite climbing roses, a permanent reminder that you can have all the money and influence in the world, but you can't beat a man who knows exactly how deep his foundations go in ISN and Oppos. T afraid to stand his ground. It makes you wonder, though, how many of us are sitting on our own corner lots letting people walk all over us because we're afraid of the noise they'll make? Is it worth the cost of the concrete to finally say enough is enough? Or are we just as guilty for letting the bullies run the HOA for this long? What would you have done if you saw those tire tracks in your dreams every night? Would you have built a bridge, or would you have built a pillar? Let me know in the comments if you think I went too far, or if you've got Cynthia in your life who needs a lesson in physics.